into my running back pick for deep shot of the year. It's a smaller guy. He's 5'7", but he was in the 97th percentile in terms of agility score and showed he can produce for the Eagles in the passing game. It's Boston Scott. And in a PPR, I like Scott a lot as a name to kind of beat to the waivers in week one. Over the last 4 years, after the last 4 games last year in Philadelphia, there were injuries to Alshon Jeffrey, Deshaun Jackson, Nelson Aguilar. So literally they're 3 starting wide receivers. Then we had Zach Ertz in and out of the lineup. And then recently retired Darren Sproles was also injured as well, who was, the pass-catching running back in Philly for the last 6 seasons. During those 4 games, Boston Scott was the RB7. In that same stretch, Whoa. Miles Sanders was the RB8. So Scott has the potential to outscore Sanders, especially in the right matchup. Listen to these reception totals for Boston Scott. He had 6 receptions, 7 receptions, 6 receptions, and then 4 receptions. Every one of those reception numbers was more than what Miles Sanders got in each of those weeks, sometimes by even 3 receptions. And so in every game with both in the lineup, Scott had more receptions than Sanders. And that could be a recurring theme here. We've seen the Eagles want to continue to use Darren Sproles, guys like that in the passing game. This is an offense that throws the ball a ton. Carson Wentz is, flirting with that elite tier of quarterbacks. He's one of those few guys that I think everyone would say, like, hey, let's pay him $30 million a year. And then another thing here, in week 17 against the Giants, Miles Sanders missed the second half. And in that half, Boston Scott had 3 rushing touchdowns. So if anything happens to Miles Sanders, you immediately have a plug-and-play guy who's going to take over both in the goal line and through the air for the Eagles. Do I expect Scott to be that good all season? No, which is why you're getting him at the RB51 at his current ADP. Unless the Eagles bring in a name like Devontae Freeman, I see Scott as a great deep sleeper option if you're feeling shaky at running back. He could even be a handcuff if you do take Miles Sanders early in the draft. But, if they bring in a name like Lamar Miller, LaShawn McCoy, that does not scare me at all for Boston Scott's value. I think he's one of those names that we could look back, kind of like Austin Eckler last year, where it's like it's a scat back, but could be extremely efficient. He's going to get some goal line opportunity, and he's on an offense that's going to be able to move the chains. So I look at all that, and it's like Boston Scott could be a very interesting one, especially in a full PPR league. So I love him, and he's a name that I'm taking super late this year in all my drafts.
I love it. I actually didn't realize that you could have rolled out the Eagles running back combo of Miles Sanders and Boston Scott in your fantasy playoffs last season and gotten 20 points a game from each of them in PPR. That just blew my mind. And Steph, we've talked about it on our mock draft episodes, taking these high value handcuffs later on in drafts, especially with some uncertainty this year with COVID and things like that. And we're always staring down Alexander Mattison, Latavius Murray, Tony Pollard as these high-value handcuffs. In reality, Boston Scott should be in that group as long as they don't bring in anybody else. We saw it happen last season. Even when Sanders was there, Boston Scott was getting work, and when Sanders went out, he blew up. So there's no reason Boston Scott should not be in that group of high-value handcuffs, and he's going after all those guys right now. So, he also probably of that group has the most standalone value in PPR format. So I love the pick there, Steph, with Boston Scott. If you are looking at those high-value handcuffs later on in those double-digit rounds, I don't see why you wouldn't take the guy. And if you have Miles Sanders, it seems like a must. And we look at a situation like Cleveland with Nick Chubb, and then Kareem Hunt has a lot of standalone value. And if something happens to Chubb, he vaults into RB1 status. I think Boston Scott is like a takedown version of that. He's got a little less standalone value than Kareem Hunt. But if something were to happen to Sanders, he would vault up into that high-end running back 2 territory.